to begin this morning by showing you an image, and I'm curious as to how you're going to respond to this. You ready for it? Just have to get my device connected here. Okay, here we go. You ready? So, I would guess that the majority of people in the church this morning, probably, if you're a hockey fan, support one of these two teams. Would that be a fair assumption? I mean, not all of you, of course. I mean, some of you might, like the Mighty Ducks or something like that, or whatever they're called these days. But most people here would probably support one of these two teams, correct? Well, you don't sound very enthusiastic. And I would guess that most of you have supported these teams, whichever one is your team, for most of your life, correct? And if I invited you today to switch and support the opposite team, you'd probably tell me no, correct? Now, there might be a few of us who would throw our support behind one of these teams based on the situation, because perhaps, like me, you didn't grow up playing hockey or with hockey. I have this kind of loyalty to a soccer team, which lost this morning, but that's a whole other thing. But I might cheer for the Leafs on one occasion and cheer for the Habs on another, but not so for the diehards. Now, I want to move from this image, which I hope to connect up with the message of my homily, but I want to show you two other sets of double images. You ready for this? Lips and a heart. In the gospel today, we see the religious leaders coming to Jesus and saying, why don't you do all the stuff we do? Why don't you do all the washing of cups and all of the rituals, all of the external rituals? And Jesus responds, he doesn't answer the question. He calls them hypocrites. He said, Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, spoke rightly about you hypocrites. I mean, Jesus doesn't exactly mince his words. And he quotes the prophet Isaiah, who says this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Lips and hearts. And the quote from Isaiah goes on to say, in vain do they worship me. Their worship is empty, because they do it with their lips, but not with their hearts. You see clearly that what Jesus is saying is that we need to move beyond the externals of religious practice. It's got to come from the heart. But here's the thing. While it's possible for it to be on the lips and not in the heart, it's also not just possible, but it is inevitable that if it is in the heart, it will also be on the lips. So it's not either or, it's both and. Now here's another set of images: an ear and hands. In the second reading today from the letter of James, we hear these words: welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. Welcome with meekness the implanted word. And the author goes on to say this: but be doers of the word, and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. So just as it is both the lips and the heart, so it's also the ear and the hands representing action, people who are doers of the word. The ear and the heart, we've got to do both. Because if we don't do both, if we don't join together the ear and the hands and the lips and the heart, we're going to get it wrong. And wrong is not so good, because wrong religion looks like this. It has these qualities. It becomes inward focused. It becomes self-centered and self-serving. A religious person can become self-centered and self-serving. And a parish can become self-centered and self-serving, celebrating empty ritual. It's a religion that's just about the externals. I saw on Twitter recently someone who said that maybe the reason why there's so many people who claim to be spiritual and not religious is because they've met too many people who are religious and not spiritual. That's when we get it wrong. But we can also get it right. And this is when the word is welcomed. When the word is welcomed with meekness, it changes our hearts. And it moves us to worship, and it moves us to action. Now, action is a response to the Word of God, to what God does in us. Remember, Christianity is not principally a moral system. It's not primarily about morality, about how we act. It's first about how we receive what God wants to do for us, but then it propels us to action. If we get it right, it propels us to action. And St. James and the gospel tell us about what it means to be doers of the word. In the second reading, we heard this, that religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. And in the gospel reading today, Jesus' teaching helps us to expand our understanding of the moral dimension of the Christian life and what it means to be doers of the word. And he tells us it's all about the heart. It's not about externals, it's about the heart and what comes out of the heart. He says this, for it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. Fornication, that word means sex outside of marriage. Theft, murder, adultery, avarice, that means greed, avarice. Wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, that the word originally used here generally means sexual immorality. Envy, that's jealousy. Slander, pride, folly. All of these evil things, Jesus says, come from within, and they defile a person. So Jesus himself gives us these areas of morality. Now, anytime we talk about Christian morality, whether it is the areas that Jesus mentions or the realm of working with widows and orphans, we need to remember that whenever we fail or fall short, that the foundation of the gospel message is mercy, right? Mercy. There's always mercy available to us. But all of these things together, being concerned about the widows and orphans, and even issues of sexual morality that Jesus speaks of today, are issues that we don't usually discuss in the same conversations, because in our culture, we tend to see them as being disconnected and existing in very different realms. In fact, we often view reality and our experience through, I would say, political categories. Political categories, left and right, we often talk about it. Like we divide these issues into issues of the left or issues of the right. But here's the thing, Christianity, when it's done right, will never fit into political categories. If we do it right, if your religion fits in a political box, you got it wrong. Because to do so is not just reductionism, it's violence to the gospel message. It's a disfigurement of what it means to be doers of the word. You see, our Christian faith moves us to demand justice for the poor and disenfranchised, the widows and orphans of our day. It calls us to recognize the dangers and the destructive power of pride and envy and greed and slander, things that sometimes run rampant in the political sphere. But it also, in this age that sees sexuality as merely a personal playground, it moves us to acknowledge that there is such a thing as sexual immorality, the things that Jesus himself names: fornication, adultery and sexual license. To be doers of the word involves bringing all of this together in an integrated whole. This is the way it was in the early church. I want to quote to you from a 2nd century letter called the Letter to Diognetus. And it's by an unknown author, but the author is describing the Christian community in the 2nd century. He says this: "There is something extraordinary about their lives. They live in their own countries as though they were only passing through. They play their full role as citizens, but labor under all the disabilities of aliens. Any country can be their homeland, but for them, their homeland, wherever it may be, is a foreign country. Like others, they marry and have children, but they do not expose them. They share their meals, but not their wives." End quote. Now, what is that reference? What is that reference to exposing children? You see, in the Greco-Roman world, it was very common to abandon children that were unwanted. So if you had too many kids, or you wanted a boy and you got another girl, or your child was handicapped in some way, you'd basically drop the kid off at the dump and leave it, or leave it by the side of the road. In most cases, the child would die. In some cases, it was a method of express adoption. This was an unquestioned common practice in the ancient world. No one had a problem with it, except the Christians. The Christians didn't do it, nor did they wife swap, as was common back then. They didn't partake in the sexual immorality of the time. They were a weird group. They also cared for widows and orphans and sick people. Their understanding of what it meant to be a doer of the word was an integrated whole. Here's my thoughts, and this is what's been on my heart for quite a while now, is this, that today, one of the greatest threats to our faith is that we view the demands of the gospel through a political lens. We squeeze our faith into political categories, and it's done by those on the political left and by those on the political right. And I see it today, especially, our dear brothers and sisters in the United States are struggling with this in parishes, in the church. People are at each other's throats because their starting point is a political category. And issues around the coronavirus have intensified this problem because they've been politicized, wearing a mask, not wearing a mask, being vaccinated, not being vaccinated. But the core issue is that we're viewing the demands of the gospel through a political lens. Here's the thing: some aspects of Catholic teaching fall in line with social conservatism. Teachings on sexuality, abortion, euthanasia, our understanding of gender and family. But other aspects of Catholic teaching fall comfortably within what some would consider to be socialism or a socialistic political stance. But the demands of the gospel will never fit completely into these categories. I want to tell you about a woman called Dorothy Day, who was a great 20th century Catholic social activist. She was a convert to Catholicism and a great social activist. She said this: "If you feed the poor, you're a saint. If you ask why they're poor, you're a communist." And she herself, who right now is in the process to be canonized a saint, she herself was accused by some, even within the church, of being a communist. And that wasn't a good thing to be accused of, especially in the 1950s in the States. But she was a holy woman who was persecuted because of her understanding of what it meant to be a doer of the word. She fought for social justice, but she also was firmly against abortion. She herself, before her conversion to Catholicism, lived a very kind of wild life and actually had an abortion herself, which she later described as being the greatest mistake of her life. She lived and professed also what would be considered traditional Catholic sexual morality. She was a doer of the word. She was a hearer of the word. She engaged her faith with our ear and her hands and with our lips and her heart, because she was a mystic. You see, she reminds us, and her life reminds us, that we cannot fit the demands of the gospel into mere political categories. Recognize these colors? If you don't, you will soon. Blue, orange, green, red, and independent. It's the weeks of elections. We've just come through a provincial election, and we're ramping up for a federal election. And here's the thing, regardless of what political color you may or may not place on your front lawn, we need to remember that to be a follower of Jesus means that we cannot have blind, absolute, or total allegiance to any political party. Nor can we opt out of the system. Remember the letter to Diognetus, who said about the Christians that they, quote, play their full role as citizens, but labor under all the disabilities of aliens. So when we go to the polls, we must go as followers of Jesus, called to be doers of the word with all that this involves. This means that we need to weigh the different values of each party. We need to weigh and consider the character of each party leader whom our vote would support. And we need to weigh the character and disposition of our local representatives. Keep in mind the complexity of our present situation. And in the face of today's issues, not the issues of 50 years ago, not the issues faced by our grandparents or our parents, or even the issues of 5 years ago, the issues of today. As Christians, voting will always be about making the best out of imperfect options, because it's not like this. No matter how much things change, or what the issues are, or what the leadership is, or how poorly or how well our team is doing, I would think that most of you who support these teams, you ain't giving them up. Our loyalty to our favorite teams is almost absolute. But as Christians, we simply can never support a political party, candidate, or brand the way that we would support the Leaves and the Habs. Not if we wish to live a religion that is pure and undefiled before God. Not if we are to care for the widows and orphans in their distress, and to keep ourselves unstained by the world.